Hello, I'm Scott Dyer. Westchester County Airport, just north of New York City, is a busy general aviation airport with jet airline operations as well. It's a major business aviation terminal for the New York metro area with a steady stream of Gulfstreams, Falcons, Challengers, and Citations. Single-engine turboprop operations have increased greatly in the last 10 years, notably with shuttle service to Boston, the Cape, and the New England Islands. But Westchester is also home to many light general aviation aircraft and several flight schools using Cessna, Diamond, and Cirrus aircraft. Flight training in the pattern and proficiency flying in the pattern is common. Light singles and twins often depart to the west over the Tappan Zee Bridge and to the east, heading for Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and Block Island. As we leave and arrive at Westchester County under visual flight rules, it pays to be aware of usual IFR and VFR traffic flows so that we can be at the right place and at the right altitude to avoid traffic conflicts. There may still be traffic out there we need to avoid, but at least we can stay away from the heaviest flows. The purpose of this video is to give you the basic flow information and to suggest ways to reduce the likelihood of traffic conflicts while you are arriving at or leaving the airport under visual flight rules. First, some basic orientation to get us all on the same page. On the portion of the sectional chart being shown, we'll put the airport in the center under a red circle. Major landmarks and navigation fixes in the immediate area include the Tappan Zee Bridge, about 7 miles to the west of the airport, over the wide part of the Hudson River. You can't miss it, but here's a circle and arrow to point it out. Approach control sends many of the VFR arrivals to White Plains from the southwest, west, and northwest and north to the bridge before heading to the airport. Up to the north and northeast of Westchester County Airport is the Carmel VOR, which is an important fix for VFR aircraft. It gets an arrow too. To the far right, again with a red arrow pointing it out, is the Bridgeport VOR. There's lots of IFR traffic inbound to Westchester that crosses the VOR before heading to the northwest, and many IFR and VFR departures from White Plains to the east overfly Bridgeport. It's a very busy place. And there's one more busy spot, an intersection called Rhymes, just southeast of the Carmel VOR. There's an arrow and a text box to point out Rhymes to you. Jets, props, and everything in between are around Rhymes when they are arriving under IFR at Westchester from the east and the south, from over Long Island and on the trip up from Florida. So that's the territory around the airport. Let's turn now to what to watch out for as you are either heading to the west as a VFR departure or inbound to the airport from the west. As you depart Westchester to the west, Tower may instruct you to head for the Tappan Zee Bridge, they often call it just the bridge, and remain at or below 1,500 feet until clear of the Class Delta airspace. We'll see why that altitude restriction is there in a moment, but you'll dutifully head for the bridge as shown by the green arrows on this picture. A complication for traffic you may face arises because, as shown in the next picture with the blue arrows, departing IFR aircraft follow tracks anywhere from northwest bound to southwest bound, climbing initially to only 3,000 feet. This includes jets, turboprops, high-performance piston aircraft, and instrument trainers doing 70 knots over the ground. Tower will restrict VFR departures to the west to 1,500 feet and below, most of the time when IFR departures are using runway 34, precisely to keep the IFR aircraft from conflicting from behind with the departing VFRs. So far, so good. The IFRs are climbing to 3,000 feet, and they'll get higher once they switch over to the departure controller. And the westbound VFRs are heading for the bridge at or below 1,500 feet. But those westbound VFR departures need to be on the lookout for opposite direction VFRs coming into Westchester from the vicinity of the bridge at the pattern altitude of 1,500 feet. Those are depicted by the red arrow. Tower usually instructs those arrivals to enter the downwind for either 1-6 or 3-4 at midfield, which helps to provide some lateral separation between the arrivals and the departures. What to do? Look for those inbound aircraft, and if there is no tower altitude restriction on how high a departing VFR aircraft can climb to 2,000 feet, or even 2,500 feet when leaving Westchester. Inbound VFRs from the west and the bridge need to keep a sharp eye out as well and proceed inbound from the bridge at 1,500 feet to provide some altitude separation from the departing aircraft. It is usually best not to wait to descend to pattern altitude until you're close into the airport and well past the bridge. And know that the Hudson River is a busy aviation route with many aircraft northbound and southbound on the river, anywhere between 1,000 feet on up to the floor of the Class Bravo airspace at 3,000 feet. Traffic displays in the cockpit help, but looking out the window is the most important traffic avoidance process. You can also get VFR advisories when inbound or when leaving Westchester. Remember, you can get a transponder code on the ground prior to departing. Just ask clearance delivery or ground control, and they will set it up for you. The key points here are, when leaving Westchester to the west, unless restricted by the tower in your climb to 2,000 or 2,500 feet to minimize conflicts with inbound aircraft coming in from the west. And when you're arriving from the west, descend down to 1,500 feet by the bridge and fly to the airport at that altitude. Let's switch our attention now to the east of Westchester Airport, thinking about possible traffic conflicts if we are departing to the east or arriving from the east. The green arrows shown indicate the general directions of VFR aircraft departing the airport to the east. The normal inclination would be for these pilots to climb immediately up to their cruise altitudes, which could be 2,500, 3,500, 5,500, or higher on up to the teens. But hold that thought. Let's see if that's a good idea under the circumstances, or maybe not. The next image shows, with the red arrows, the paths of VFR arrivals back into Westchester from the east. Some of these are piston singles or twins, descending from relatively modest altitudes of 4,500 or 6,500 feet. Many these days, though, are Pilatus turboprops, or others of similar performance, descending on their flights from Nantucket and the New England Islands from the mid-teens, and they're coming into Westchester at speeds approaching 250 knots. They are fast movers, opposite direction, and heading downhill from above at high rates of descent. High rates, anyway, for those of us who fly single-engine piston airplanes. With that sort of potential conflicting traffic, what is a departing airplane to do? One technique is to climb on departure initially to only 2,000 or 2,500 feet and delay the rest of the climb until well east of Westchester. And where that somewhere well east of Westchester Point is, we'll get to that in a minute. Staying at or below 2,500 feet will keep the VFR departing aircraft below most of those fast-moving and descending arrivals from the east. The wisdom of not climbing higher than 2,500 feet too soon after departing to the east from Westchester is borne out by looking at the potential conflicts with IFR traffic arriving at Westchester. The blue arrows show the general routing of IFR arrivals on what's called the sound visual approach to runway 34. These aircraft are usually at 3,000 feet, heading southeast past the Carmel VOR and continuing southeast toward Stamford and Greenwich on the coast of Long Island Sound. They generally descend to 2,000 feet once past the shoreline and turn base and then final for runway 34 at 2,000. This is pretty much the same track that ATC uses for IFR arrivals to runway 34, even when the weather is too low for the visual approach. It's 3,000 until the shoreline, then 2,000 over the water, and then vectors for the final approach to runway 34. So, if you're climbing out of Westchester VFR to the east, and runway 34 is active, you'll want to stay below the 3,000-foot IFR traffic, which is heavily jets, on the visual approach or being vectored. Stopping the climb at 2,500 or below helps to minimize those potential conflicts. By the time you're abeam Norwalk, you're pretty well east of those IFR arrivals to Westchester on the visual approach. But before you climb, there's more to consider. Remember back at our initial orientation to the neighborhood around the airport, and the last fix that I mentioned was Rhymes? It was an intersection southeast of Carmel and west of Bridgeport. Well, here it is again. As mentioned before, a lot of IFR traffic, including many jets, get routed over Rhymes. The blue line shows the general flow of traffic. Most of that traffic passes over and near the Bridgeport VOR on the way to Rhymes, descending through roughly 7,000 feet around Bridgeport to about 4,000 feet at Rhymes. The traffic at or around Rhymes is usually descended to 3,000, and if runway 34 is in use, they're turned toward the shoreline, and they get 2,000 feet once they're past the shoreline and over the water. On the other hand, if runway 16 is in use, the traffic continues on a northwesterly heading past Rhymes, usually descending to 3,000 toward the 16 final approach course. What that means is that above 3,000 feet, somewhere on the line between Bridgeport and Rhymes, you'll likely have high-speed jet traffic moving right to left as you depart Westchester. So perhaps staying at 2,500 feet until you're past the Bridgeport-Rhymes line is a good idea, and then start the rest of your climb at that point. Now, using your well-honed VOR navigation skills, or just glancing at the moving map, you'll be past that line when departing Westchester, when you're beyond a line that's drawn between the Carmel and the Bridgeport VORs. Our TRACON controllers have repeatedly mentioned that IFR-VFR conflicts are frequent in the area between Bridgeport and Rhymes. Now, there's another traffic flow that you should be aware of too. When the wind is out of the south or the southwest, LaGuardia is often landing on runway 22. Westchester will usually be using runway 16 on these days, so the sound visual to 34 and IFR traffic for Westchester being vectored south of the shoreline just aren't factors because they're not there. But those LaGuardia arrivals may be factors. Here's the picture. The blue line on this image shows the general path that LaGuardia arrivals take on such days, with the turn to the southwest somewhere in the vicinity of, or just past, the shoreline. They are descending from 4,000 to 3,000. The green lines are our old friends, the Westchester VFR departures to the east. Some of those VFR departures are pretty capable and fast-moving airplanes, turboprops, and even some jets on short-range repositioning trips. If you are flying these, be careful. Your great climb performance can put you squarely into the path of these LaGuardia arrivals. Again, staying lower than you might otherwise choose can be a very prudent decision. Before we leave the east side of Westchester, consider for a moment the situation of VFR arrivals from the east. These are people coming back into Westchester. Those arrivals from the east will have several streams of traffic conflicts to be aware of and avoid. On this picture, the arrivals from the east are in green arrows. You'll have to avoid the flow of Bridgeport to Rhymes traffic, which is depicted by the thick blue arrow line, starting around 7,000 feet at Bridgeport and down to 3,000 to 4,000 feet by the time those aircraft get to Rhymes. You'll need to avoid the possible sound visual 3-4 arrivals, or aircraft being vectored to 3-4, at 3,000 feet over the land and descending to 2,000 feet over the water of Long Island Sound, which are also thick blue arrows. And you want to avoid the opposite direction stream of red arrow VFRs leaving Westchester. For many of us in piston aircraft, this means descending to below 3,000 feet when passing Bridgeport, and then continuing down to 2,000 or 2,500 feet when within 15 miles or so of the airport, or roughly a beam Norwalk. This takes care of most of the IFR conflicting traffic, but still leaves you having to avoid opposite direction red arrow VFRs heading east at those same altitudes. It's about the best we can do, altitude-wise, to minimize conflicts, but conflicts aren't eliminated. The picture also shows, as the orange arrows, the LaGuardia arrivals for when that flow is active, but most of our operations arriving at the airport will be well below the LaGuardia arrival stream. My advice is to stack the deck in your favor and use traffic advisories or flight following whenever you can. Heading into Westchester from the east, contact New York on 124.07 before you get to the Bridgeport area. Get a transponder code, and they will almost always be able to hand you off to the controller handling Westchester arrivals. That Westchester controller, who may also be handling LaGuardia arrivals, is often quite busy, and having a tagged up target handed off to them is easier than having to do that work themselves. Leaving Westchester, ask ground controller clearance delivery for a transponder code and flight following before you call for taxi clearance. It's easy, and it also helps reduce the workload on the TRACON controller. The key points here are, first, use flight following with traffic advisories into and out of White Plains. When arriving from the east, get your transponder code even before you reach Bridgeport on 124.07. Second, review the expected traffic flows before you depart or arrive, taking note whether Westchester will be using 1.6 or 3.4, whether the wind is from the south or southwest such that LaGuardia overhead traffic at 4,000 descending to 3,000 might be an issue. Engaging your climb to avoid the Westchester arrivals for 3.4 and the heavy IFR traffic between Bridgeport and Rhymes. There's one more area around Westchester that is deserving of mention for traffic avoidance, and that's the shoreline south of the airport. There is a good bit of VFR traffic along the shoreline between 1,000 and 2,000 feet, especially in the summer months. Take a look again at the Sound Visual 3.4 traffic track, and roughly that same track applies to IFR arrivals to runway 3.4 being vectored there. Now see where that VFR traffic is. Yes, right under or through the runway 3.4 final. This is not a good thing, both for collision hazards and for wake turbulence avoidance. If you're going to fly the shoreline route, be around 1,000 feet at most until clear of the Westchester final. Use caution for wake turbulence, and remain far enough offshore that you aren't in the Westchester Class Delta. Yes, the Class Delta extends past the shoreline, and not everyone who flies the shoreline bothers to call the tower when flying through that Class Delta airspace. This concludes our look at VFR traffic conflict avoidance at Westchester County Airport. I hope that you found this video to be helpful. If you have any questions, you can contact me through the website displayed on the screen. Until next time, fly safely.